The ships came without warning. One moment the sky above Earth was clear and quiet. The next moment, 17 massive warships appeared in orbit, hanging above the planet like dark mountains that had always been there and had only now decided to be seen. They did not rush. They did not fire. They simply arrived, slow and heavy, the way something moves when it knows that nothing in the universe can stop it. On the ground, every emergency system on the planet went off at once. Sirens screamed across cities. Screens in living rooms, restaurants, and train stations cut away from whatever they were showing and filled with a single emergency message. People stepped out of their offices and stood on sidewalks, looking up at a sky that looked the same as it always had because the ships were too far up to see with bare eyes. But people looked anyway. They could feel that something was up there. The air felt different. Heavier. In Geneva, deep underground inside a bunker built beneath the old UN building, a man named Tiho was already sitting at a long table when the news broke. He had a cup of tea in front of him. It was still warm. His aide, a sharp young woman who moved like she was always one step behind where she needed to be, had run into the room out of breath, a tablet pressed against her chest, already trying to explain what the orbital sensors were picking up. Tiho already knew. He let her explain anyway. It was good practice for her. He was the UN Defense Secretary. Not a general, though he had worked beside generals his whole career. Not a scientist, though many of the most secret science programs on Earth had been funded by his signature on classified documents. He was the kind of man who spent his life preparing for things that most people preferred not to think about. He had been thinking about this particular thing for 40 years. He had built plans around it. He had built programs around it. He had built his entire career around the quiet certainty that one day something would come from out there, and when it did, Earth would not be caught without an answer. He told his aide to sit down. Then he picked up his tea and took a long, slow sip. Up in orbit, inside the largest of the 17 ships, a creature named Galren stood at a floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the blue and green world below him. He had large, dark gray hands pressed flat against the glass, and his two pairs of eyes moved slowly across the curve of the planet, the way a buyer looks at something in a market stall before deciding what price to offer. Galren was the grand emissary of the Volcae Empire. The empire stretched across a wide arm of the galaxy and had consumed more than 400 civilizations over 4 centuries. He had personally overseen 63 of those negotiations. He was very good at his job, and his job had never once been difficult. Behind him, his intelligence officer Salvan stood at a wide display screen, reading through the human file. It was a thin file. That alone was almost funny. Salvan read it carefully, the way you read the menu at a place you already know you are not going to enjoy. The species called themselves humans. They lived on one planet. They had reached space only 200 years ago, which by galactic standards was practically this morning. They had no unified military structure. No recorded contact with other civilizations. A long and well-documented history of going to war against each other over small pieces of land and old disagreements. Their fastest ships were slow. Their best weapons were outdated. Salvan set the tablet down and told Galren that the species presented no meaningful threat. Galren made a low sound deep in his chest. It was a laugh. On his species, the laugh was a slow, rolling rumble that you felt more than heard, and it moved through the bridge of the ship like a soft tremor. The officers around him laughed too, in their own ways, each of them understanding the joke without it needing to be explained. This was always how it went. The Empire arrived. The species saw the size of the fleet. The species panicked. The Empire delivered its terms. The species signed within the hour, sometimes faster. It had gone that way so many times that it had stopped feeling like conquest. It felt more like filling out a form. Then a signal came up from the planet. It came on 11 different frequencies, all at the same time, perfectly timed and clean, carrying a single greeting message in a structured format that the Volcae translation system recognized without trouble. The message itself was simple and polite, but Salvan stared at the frequency readout for a few seconds longer than he needed to. Broadcasting on 11 simultaneous bands required a very precise kind of technical knowledge. It was not the kind of thing a young civilization stumbled into. It was the kind of thing you had to understand deeply to pull off cleanly. He wrote a small note in the file. Then he moved on. Galren transmitted the Empire's opening terms. Short, clear. The same message that had been delivered to 400 worlds before this one. Humans would surrender all resource rights to the Empire. Humans would accept imperial governance over their planet. In return, humans would be kept alive and put to useful work. By Volkai standards, this was generous. Some species had received nothing. In the bunker, Tiho heard the full translation through the small earpiece in his right ear. Minji, sitting 2 seats to his left, had already translated it herself before the machine finished. She was the best xenolinguist Earth had, and she had been studying patterns pulled from deep space signals for 11 years straight. She looked at Tiho when the message ended. She did not look afraid. Neither did he. Tiho leaned forward and pressed the transmit button on the table. He spoke 4 words. "We'll need more time." On the flagship, Galren read the translated reply on his screen. He read it a second time. He turned and looked at Salvan. Neither of them spoke for a moment. This had never happened before. Not a yes, not a no, not even a panicked question, a scheduling request. As if 17 warships above your planet were a minor inconvenience and the Empire was simply arriving at a bad time. Galren laughed again, louder now. He granted the request. 72 hours. More time than the Empire had ever given any species in its history. He granted it because it was funny, and because he wanted to see what a small, frightened civilization would do with 72 hours when there was absolutely nothing useful they could do. He pictured people screaming in the streets, leaders arguing, governments falling apart. He was still almost smiling when he turned away from the screen. Down in the bunker, Tiho exhaled once, slowly and quietly. 72 hours was more than enough. His aide was already at her station, sending out a string of encrypted signals to people in different countries who had been waiting years for exactly this message. People who had spent those years building things, testing things, and saying nothing to anyone outside their small, careful circles. Minji already had her headphones on and her screens full of Voakai signal data, working fast and focused. Like someone solving a puzzle they have been looking at for a long time and can finally touch. Tiho looked up at the ceiling for a moment. Through the rock and metal and miles of sky above him, the ships were still up there, waiting for a species they thought had nothing to offer and nowhere to run. He picked up his tea. It was still warm. He got to work. The first 12 hours of the 72 passed without a single word from Earth. No more transmissions, no more requests, no updates, no questions, no panicked messages begging for better terms, just silence. The kind of silence that, on any of the 400 worlds the Voakai had visited before this one, meant that the species in question was either frozen in fear or falling apart behind closed doors. Galren assumed it was both. He had seen it many times. The initial shock hit first, then the arguments started, then the governments cracked, and by the time the deadline arrived, whoever was left standing usually signed whatever was put in front of them just to make it stop. He was not worried. Salvan was. He did not say this out loud. Saying it out loud would have required explaining it, and he was not yet sure he could explain it in a way that didn't sound like nervousness dressed up as analysis. But something was sitting in the back of his mind and refusing to leave. He kept returning to the 11 frequency signal from the first contact. He kept returning to the 4 words that had come back in response to the Empire's terms. Not fear, not anger, not a counterplea. Just a calm, flat request for more time. Delivered the way someone asks a guest to wait in the hall while they finish setting the table. Salvan pulled up the human file again, and started reading more carefully than he had the first time. He found the wars first. Humans had fought each other constantly across every continent on their planet for as long as their recorded history went back. Thousands of conflicts, hundreds of large ones. The file listed them with dates and casualty numbers and noted them as evidence of a chaotic and self-destructive species. Solvan had read that note the first time and agreed with it. Now he read the same list again and something about it bothered him. He couldn't name it yet. He moved on. He found the technology records next. Primitive by Volkai standards, true, but the rate of change in the human technology record was unusual. Every major conflict in their history had been followed by a sudden push forward in their science and engineering. Every time they had suffered a great loss, they had come back with something new, not just rebuilt, upgraded. The pattern repeated so many times across so many centuries that it stopped looking like recovery and started looking like something else. Something more deliberate. He wrote another note in the file, kept reading. Meanwhile, in the bunker under Geneva, the 72 hours were being used the way a surgeon uses the minutes before an operation. No wasted motion. No panic. Just precise and focused work done by people who had been quietly training for exactly this moment for a very long time. A woman named Nari was the one running the most important piece of it. She was small and spoke rarely, and had the kind of face that gave nothing away even when everything around her was moving fast. She ran a program that had no public name. Inside certain classified documents it was called Project IRONVIL. Outside those documents it did not exist at all. She had been leading it for 9 years. Before her, 2 other directors had led it. The program itself was 38 years old. What it had produced in those 38 years was a collection of technology built from pieces that humans should not have had. Small fragments of 3 separate contact events, each one kept off the public record, each one quietly gathered and studied and reverse-engineered by a rotating team of scientists who had signed agreements so serious that most of them had never told even their families what they were working on. The results were not complete. They were not perfect. But they were real, and they were ready, and Nari was now activating systems that had been sitting in a finished state for 2 years, waiting for exactly this kind of morning. She made one call before starting, short, to a number that connected to an admiral named Wubin, who was already aboard his command ship in Earth's orbit. She said 4 words. IRONVIL is going live. There was a pause on the other end. Then Wubin said, understood, and ended the call. Within the next 2 hours, something strange happened in Earth's orbit. The unified Earth fleet, which had been sitting in a visible defensive ring around the planet, began to move. But it did not move toward the Volkai ships. It moved away from Earth, outward, spreading in different directions, each ship heading toward a pre-assigned coordinate somewhere in the darkness of the solar system. On the Volkai sensors, it looked exactly like what it would have looked like if it were exactly what it appeared to be, a fleet scattering, running, falling apart under the pressure of an impossible situation. On the flagship, one of the bridge officers pointed it out to Galren with barely hidden amusement. Their military is leaving, he said. They are running away. Galren watched the display for a moment. Then he nodded and turned away. He had seen that too. Species sometimes tried to hide their best ships before signing, hoping to preserve a small piece of their military for later. It never worked, but it was a natural instinct. He did not hold it against them. He did not consider the possibility that the fleet was not running, that each ship had moved to a specific coordinate chosen not out of fear, but out of mathematics, that the positions formed a pattern which would only become visible and meaningful later, when it was too late for the Volkai formation to adjust for it. On one of the communication channels that was running quietly in the background, a signal came through that was flagged as unusual. It was a narrowband transmission, low power, sent from the orbital negotiation station the Empire had allowed to remain in place. It was not directed at Earth. It was directed at the Volkai flagship specifically. and the voice that came through it was calm and careful and spoke in broken but recognizable Voakai language. It was Minji. She was not sending a message on behalf of Earth's government. She introduced herself simply as a linguist. She said she had been studying Voakai signal patterns and wanted to try a short conversation if the Empire had no objection. On the flagship, the bridge officer looked at Galren. Galren waved his hand. Let her talk. It was harmless. It might even be interesting in a small way, the way a pet doing a new trick is briefly interesting. Minji spoke. She asked simple questions about language structure. She made small observations about the differences between Voakai formal speech and the patterns she had noticed in their tactical broadcasts. She was polite, thoughtful, careful with every word. What she was actually doing was keeping the channel open. Because while she talked, Nari's systems were quietly using that same channel to map the interior layout of the flagship in more detail than the Empire would ever have allowed if they had understood what was happening. By the time the conversation ended, Minji had said goodbye warmly, and the bridge officer had told Galren the whole exchange was harmless and slightly amusing. Salvan said nothing. He was staring at his screen, at the file, at the pattern in the human war records that he still could not name, but that was starting to feel less like chaos and more like something he had seen before in a different context entirely. He had seen it in training programs. Long, brutal, repeated training programs, designed to produce one thing above everything else: capability. He sat back in his chair. Around him, the bridge was calm and easy, and everyone was waiting without any real concern for a deadline that was still 60 hours away, from a species that had already scattered its own fleet and was now sending a linguist to make small talk. Salvan looked at the file one more time. He opened a new document and began writing a report that nobody had asked him to write. He had a feeling someone was going to need it. The 72 hours ended on a Tuesday morning in Geneva. Tiho put on his jacket, checked that his earpiece was working, and walked out of the bunker for the first time since the ships had arrived. He did not take a weapon. He did not take a large team. He took Minji, who was already waiting by the transport with a small bag over her shoulder and her tablet in her hand, and 2 aides who had been briefed on exactly how to behave, which mostly meant staying quiet and looking calm no matter what happened. The transport carried them up to the orbital negotiation station. It was a small structure the Voakai had placed in low orbit 2 days earlier, a neutral space, roughly the size of a large conference hall, built from gray Voakai materials that made the inside feel cold and heavy, and designed to remind anyone sitting inside it that the Empire had built it, and the Empire owned it, and the Empire was doing the other party a favor by allowing them to sit in it at all. The table in the center was wide and dark, and slightly too tall for human proportions, which was either an accident or a choice. Galren was already seated when Tiho walked in. Beside him sat Salvan, who had dark circles under 2 of his 4 eyes that had not been there 2 days ago. Behind them both, standing near the wall with his arms folded and his expression flat and cold, was Warlord Dreeth. He had not been part of the original negotiation team. He had inserted himself that morning. Nobody had questioned it, because questioning Dreeth was the kind of decision that tended to shorten your career in ways that were difficult to come back from. Galren had the Imperial surrender documents laid out across the table before the humans had even fully sat down. The gesture was deliberate. This is what you are here to sign. This is the only reason we are in this room. Everything else is background noise. Tiho looked at the documents. He looked at them the way you look at something that has nothing to do with you. Then he reached across the table with one hand and very slowly, very calmly, slid them back toward Galren. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a pause in conversation. A different kind of quiet. The kind that arrives when something happens that was not supposed to be possible, and for a moment everyone in the room needs a second to catch up to it. Galren looked at the documents. Then he looked at Tiho. His four eyes moved slowly, the way they did when something was being processed rather than simply observed. Tiho opened the bag that one of his aides had set on the table. He took out a document of his own. It was printed and bound, clean and professional, the kind of thing that took time to prepare. He set it on the table and pushed it across. "We have a counteroffer," Tiho said. On the Vorkai side of the table, nobody laughed this time. Galren picked up the document. He opened it. He began reading. His mandibles, which usually sat loose and relaxed at the sides of his jaw, slowly pressed flat against his face as he moved through the pages. Salvan leaned over and read alongside him, and as he read, something shifted behind his eyes that was not quite fear but was closely related to it. The document was not a plea. It was not a request for mercy or a negotiation for slightly better surrender terms. It was a full partnership proposal, structured like a business agreement, written in clear, precise language with numbered clauses and defined terms and an appendix of supporting data. Humanity was offering the Vorkai Empire shared resource extraction rights across 3 sectors of the solar system, a mutual defense clause against other galactic powers, a technology exchange program, and representation for Earth inside imperial governance structures at a level that treated humanity not as a conquered labor caste, but as a new and equal member of the Empire. It was, by every standard the Empire had ever used to measure such things, completely absurd. Dreeth stepped forward from the wall. He had read over Galren's shoulder long enough to understand the shape of it. He did not pick up the document. He looked at Tiho directly and said that the deadline had passed, the terms had not been accepted, and the fleet would now begin targeting Earth's major population centers. He said it the way someone reads a procedure off a checklist. No anger, no drama, just the next step in a process that had always gone the same way. It was meant to collapse the conversation instantly. It always did. The moment the fleet was mentioned, the other side remembered what they were actually facing, and the rest was just waiting for the signature. Tiho did not flinch. He did not look at Minji or at his aides. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small holoprojector, the kind that fit in one hand. He set it on the table and turned it on. What appeared above the table was a 3-dimensional map of the Vorkai fleet. Every ship, every position, every reactor signature, every blind spot in every vessel's sensor range. The map rotated slowly above the table, clean and detailed and precise, labeled in both human text and Vorkai script. It showed the fleet not from the outside, the way any telescope could, but from within the formation itself, from angles that only existed if you had eyes already inside it. Dreeth stopped talking. Salvan stared at the map. His report, the one nobody had asked him to write and which he had finished 2 hours before this meeting, had warned about something like this. He had submitted it before boarding the transport. He did not know if anyone had read it. Galren's mandibles were fully flat now, pressed hard against his jaw. Tiho said nothing. He let them look at the map. He let the silence do the work that words would have done less cleanly. Then Nari's voice came through on an open channel. It arrived simultaneously on every Vorkai ship in the fleet, bypassing the Imperial encryption system that had never been broken by any civilization in 400 years of Imperial history. Her voice was quiet, and even and sounded like someone leaving a polite note rather than making a threat. She said that humanity had cataloged 412 structural vulnerabilities across the 17 ships in orbit. She said this was not a threat. She said it was simply an effort to make sure both sides were working with the same information before continuing the conversation. Dreeth turned to the communications officer behind him and ordered the strike to go ahead. His voice was tight but certain. He was certain they were bluffing. Species in this position always bluffed. They had the data, fine. That did not mean they had the reach. Knowing where the vulnerabilities were and being able to hit them from an unknown position were two completely different things, and the human fleet was scattered and running somewhere out in the dark. He gave the order. 4 Volkai fighter escorts went dark at the same instant. Not destroyed, not hit by missiles or beams that showed up on any sensor, just dark, powered down, systems shut off remotely and completely. 4 ships that had been active and crewed and fully armed 30 seconds ago were now sitting silent in orbit like empty shells. Nobody fired a shot. The bridge of the flagship had never been this quiet in its entire operational history. Dreeth stood very still with his arms at his sides. Galren had not moved from his chair. Salvan had closed his eyes. Corvus, the youngest member of the Volkai delegation, who had been standing near the door and had said nothing since the meeting began, pressed his back slowly against the wall and looked at Minji from across the room. She was watching Tiho. Her expression was calm and attentive, the way it always was when she was following something closely and already knew how it ended. Corvus recognized that expression now. He had seen it once before, on a different world, on the face of a commander who had already won the battle and was simply waiting for the other side to finish counting their losses. He had never seen it on the losing side of a table. Until now, he had always assumed that was where he sat. Nobody in the room moved for a long time. The 4 dark ships sat silent in orbit, visible on every screen and every sensor readout on the flagship. No explosion, no debris, no sign of what had hit them or where it had come from. They were simply off, the way a light goes off when someone flips a switch in another room. Clean, instant, total. The crews inside those ships were alive and unhurt and completely unable to do anything at all, because every system they depended on had been shut down from somewhere outside, and they had no idea how to turn it back on. Dreeth stood in the middle of the negotiation room and did not speak. This was unusual. Dreeth always spoke. He was the kind of person who filled silence the way water fills a container, automatically and completely. But right now he had nothing to fill it with. His order had been given. The strike had not happened. 4 of his ships were sitting dead in space, and no alarm on his fleet had caught the moment it occurred, which meant that whatever had done it had moved through their sensor network without leaving a mark. That was not supposed to be possible. Galren turned slowly in his chair and looked at Tiho. Tiho was watching him with a quiet and patient expression, the kind you wear when you are waiting for someone to finish a thought they started on their own. Galren said, carefully and without any of the ease that had been in his voice 2 days ago, that he was requesting a ceasefire. Tiho nodded once. He said that was fine. Then he said they should probably also recall whatever strike order was still active in the fleet system before someone followed through on it out of confusion. He said this in a helpful way, as though he were pointing out that someone had left a door open. Galren sent the recall order. What happened next was not dramatic. It did not look like a victory or a defeat from the outside. But inside the negotiation room, and inside the flagship, and inside every Volkai ship in orbit, something had shifted so completely and so quietly that it would take hours for most of them to fully understand what they were now standing in. Salvan understood it first. He left the negotiation room at the first reasonable pause and went back to the flagship alone. He sat at his station and opened the human file one more time, but this time he did not read what was in it. He read around it. He looked at what the file did not say. He looked at the gaps, the things that a species with 2 centuries of spaceflight should have had on record that were simply absent. No detailed weapons testing records. No public military R&D disclosures. No open-source scientific publications past a certain date in certain specific fields. Just clean, smooth absences where information should have been. He had read those absences before as a sign of a young civilization that had not yet developed those things. Now he read them as something else entirely. You only have clean absences in the places where something is being deliberately kept out of sight. Gaps that shape meant something was filling them. Something hidden. Something that had been hidden for a long time by people who were very good at hiding things. He pulled up the energy signature data that the fleet's passive sensors had been collecting since they arrived. He ran it through a deeper analysis than the standard scan. And slowly, across the display, Earth stopped looking like a small and lightly defended planet and started looking like a place that had been turned, carefully and completely, into something else over a period of decades. Underground facilities that read like civilian infrastructure, but ran power loads that no civilian operation needed. Communication relays disguised as weather satellites. Gravitational drift patterns in the outer solar system that suggested large objects moving on controlled trajectories in the dark. And the fleet. The scattered human fleet, which he now mapped against the gravitational charts of the solar system, and which, when he plotted every ship's position against every other ship's position, formed a pattern so precise it could not have happened by accident or by fear. They were not scattered. They were surrounding the HFY formation from every angle at once, sitting at calculated distances that cut off every viable jump point for an emergency FTL exit. The humans had done it so slowly, over so many hours, moving individual ships so quietly and so far apart, that the fleet's automated threat systems had never flagged any single movement as dangerous. Wubin had moved an entire fleet into a perfect encirclement, without the HFY noticing it was happening. Salvan sat back in his chair. He thought about the wars, the long, constant, brutal human wars that the file had described as evidence of chaos. He thought about the pattern he had noticed in them, the way each one was followed by a push forward, the way the species had come back from every disaster with something new and harder and more capable than what it had before. He had started to understand it before the meeting. Now he understood it completely. Humans had not been fighting each other out of weakness. They had been running the longest and most intensive military development program in the known galaxy, and they had been running it live on themselves for centuries. Every war was a test. Every loss was data. Every time the species nearly broke itself apart, it learned something specific and permanent about how not to break. The violence in the human record was not a flaw in the species. It was the method. Brutal and costly and deeply inefficient by any outside measure, but over a long enough time, it had produced a civilization that was prepared for threats from every direction, because it had already survived versions of most of them. And then quietly, sometime in the last half-century, humanity had stopped fighting each other and turned all of that accumulated knowledge outward. Not in aggression, in preparation. Silent, patient, disciplined preparation for a day that most of their own public did not know was coming. That day was today. Inside the negotiation station, a door on the far side of the room opened and a man named Junho walked in. He was not tall. He had a calm face and moved without any wasted motion. He was wearing the same plain gray clothes as the maintenance workers who serviced the station, which was exactly what he had been dressed, as for the past 2 days, while he and 11 other members of a unit called Aegis had been living quietly inside the walls of the station and 3 HFY support ships, placed there during the window between first contact and the start of negotiations. Nobody had checked them. The Empire had never needed to check maintenance staff before. Junho stood near the door and nodded to Tiho without a word. Tiho nodded back. Dreeth noticed the exchange. He looked at Junho. He looked at his own security officer, who was standing 2 meters away and who had not flagged the man's entry. Then he looked around the room slowly, the way you look around a familiar place when something tells you that it is no longer quite what you thought it was. He reached for the weapon at his side. He stopped when he realized that Junho was already standing behind him. He had not seen him move. "We're not asking for surrender," Junho said quietly, close enough that only Dreeth could hear it clearly. "We're asking you to sit back down." Dreeth stood very still for a long moment. Every instinct he had built across a lifetime of military command was telling him to do something, to push, to escalate, to make the thing that had just happened cost the other side enough that it couldn't happen again. But his 4 escort ships were still dark outside. His fleet was sitting inside a human encirclement it hadn't noticed being built, and the man behind him had crossed a secured room without making a sound. Dreeth sat down. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. And in that moment, in the silence of that small room in orbit above a small blue planet that the Empire had arrived at 3 days ago, expecting nothing and no one worth serious thought, the laughter that had started this whole thing finished dying. It went out quietly, the way the 4 ships had. The second meeting began without ceremony. No documents were prearranged on the table. No terms were laid out in advance. Nobody on either side of the room made a speech or a threat or a grand opening statement. Tiho simply sat down, folded his hands on the table, and looked at Galren the way you look at someone when you are ready to begin something real and are waiting to see if they are ready too. Galren looked back at him for a long moment. Something had changed in his face, not broken, not collapsed, but different. The easy, settled weight of a being who had never in his life sat across a table from something he did not already fully understand was gone, and what had replaced it was something older and quieter. Galren had lived a long life inside the Volkai Empire. He had seen powerful things and frightening things and things that had no easy name. But he had never, in all of that time, felt genuinely uncertain about the outcome of a negotiation before it was finished. He felt it now. He picked up his pen. What followed was 6 hours of real negotiation. Not the kind the Empire usually ran, which was less a negotiation and more a slow walk toward a signature that was already decided before anyone sat down. This was different. This was 2 sides going through a document clause by clause, pushing back on language, asking questions, requesting changes, and occasionally sitting in silence for several minutes while someone on one side consulted with someone off-room before giving an answer. It was slow and sometimes uncomfortable, and required both sides to say things they would not have said if either of them had felt fully in control of the situation. That was, Tiho had always believed, the only condition under which honest agreements got made. Minji handled most of the language work on the human side, catching places where a word translated into Volkai in a way that changed the meaning of a whole clause, flagging them quietly and suggesting alternatives that held the intent without the ambiguity. She had been preparing for this specific kind of work for years. She moved through the Volkai language the way someone moves through a building they have studied the blueprints of for a long time and are now finally walking through in person. Confident, careful, noticing things that others walked past. Corvus watched her from his seat at the far end of the Volkai side of the table. He had said very little during the meeting. He had been saying very little since the 4 ships went dark the day before, because most of what he was thinking was not the kind of thing that was useful to say out loud in a room full of Imperial officers. But he watched Minji work, and he thought about the conversation they had not quite had during the first contact window, the one where he had warned her to take the original terms, and she had smiled at him in a way he still could not fully interpret. He understood it better now. Near the end of the 4th hour, during a break, he crossed the room and stood beside her. She was reviewing a section of the document on her tablet and did not look up, but she shifted slightly to give him space, which he understood as an invitation. He said quietly that he had been studying humans for 6 years, that he had read everything the Empire had on them, which he now understood was not very much and was mostly wrong. That he had come on this mission believing it would be the same as every other mission, and that he wanted to say, plainly, that he had been completely mistaken about what he was going to find here. Minji looked up from her tablet. She said that was a very honest thing to say. He said that he would like to request asylum on Earth when this was over. that he did not think he could go back to the Empire after this. Not because the Empire would punish him for what had happened, though it might, but because he had understood something during the last 3 days that he could not ununderstand, and he did not think he could do his job the same way again after understanding it. Minji said she would pass the request to Tiho. Tiho approved it before the break was over. The document that was signed at the end of the 6th hour was not the counteroffer Tiho had brought to the table at the start. That document had been the opening position, and opening positions were meant to be negotiated down from. The final agreement was something that had not fully existed before the meeting began. It had been built in the room, piece by piece, out of real conversation between two sides that were both, for the first time, being honest about what they could offer and what they actually needed. Humanity got recognized standing in the galactic community, a formal seat, a voice, not a large voice yet but a real one, resource agreements that benefited both sides, a framework for future contact. And a clause, written carefully and placed near the front of the document where it could not be missed, that stated clearly that Earth was a sovereign world under the full protection of its own defense forces, and that any future interaction between the Volcae Empire and humanity would take place between equals. Galren signed it. His hand was steady. Whatever he was feeling, he kept it behind his face, which Tiho respected. He had not come here to humiliate anyone. He had come to get the right outcome and go home. When it was done, Galren sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked, in a voice that had no performance in it, just a plain question from one person to another, how long humanity had been preparing for something like this. Tiho thought about it, not because he didn't know the answer, because he was deciding how much of the answer to give. He said that they had been ready for someone like the Volcae since before his grandfather was born, that they hadn't known the name or the shape of what was coming, but they had known that something would come eventually, and they had decided, quietly and collectively, and without telling most of their own people, that when it arrived, Earth would not be standing in the open with nothing in its hands. Galren looked at him for a moment. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and walked out of the room. The fleet left Earth's orbit the following morning. 17 ships moving out slowly and in formation, climbing away from the planet in the pale, early light of a Wednesday sunrise. They did not leave in defeat exactly. They had not been beaten in battle. They had not surrendered. What had happened to them was harder to name than that and would take their historians a long time to write about accurately. They left changed, not smaller, just different. The way you are different after you have encountered something that does not fit into any category you already had. Salvan stood at the window of the flagship as Earth fell away below him and thought about the report he had written. He had updated it twice since the negotiation ended. The final version was long and detailed, and said things that the Imperial Intelligence Bureau was not going to enjoy reading. It would be classified immediately. It would be distributed to every Volcae military commander in the Empire within the week. Its summary was short, and he had spent more time on those few lines than on anything else in the document, because he wanted to make sure that whoever read it fast and skipped to the end still understood the most important thing. It said, do not approach the humans as a target. Do not approach them as a curiosity or an experiment. Approach them only as a peer, and even then proceed with care. This species does not bluff. They do not posture. When they appear weak, check your assumptions. When they appear calm, check your fleet. Back in Geneva, Tiho returned to the bunker. Not because he needed to, because he had left his tea there and he wanted to finish it. He sat at the long table in the quiet room and drank the last of it cold, which was fine. He had drunk cold tea before. Minji was already in her new office upstairs, which was no longer a secret office, working through Corvus's language at a pace that was making the rest of the xenolinguistics team quietly anxious about their own job security. Wubin had brought the fleet back to standard patrol routes the same morning, routine, unhurried, as if nothing particularly unusual had happened, which was exactly the impression he wanted to give, because the Empire's long-range sensors were almost certainly still watching. And in the asteroid belt in the outer dark of the solar system, the listening posts that humanity had placed there 20 years ago continued their quiet work, watching, logging, waiting. They had been built for exactly this kind of long, patient, unannounced vigil, and they were very good at it, and they would keep doing it for as long as they were needed. Which, by Nari's estimate, was going to be a while yet. She had already started the paperwork for IRONVEIL's successor program. She had a name for it, and a funding proposal, and a list of 12 scientists she wanted on it before the end of the month. She had learned a great deal from the Volkai fleet's reactor signatures during the standoff, enough to begin something new. Enough to take the next step in a process that had no final step, because the universe was large and full of unknowns, and the only honest answer to that fact was to keep preparing. She signed the first document of the new program and set it in her outbox. Outside, the sky was clear and ordinary and blue, and the stars above it were the same stars they had always been, patient and distant and full of things that had not yet arrived. Earth was ready for them. It always had been.